The parking lot of a bustling suburban grocery store was alive with the sounds of life, a cart rattling over pavement, a child's laughter echoing in the distance, and the low hum of conversation between neighbors. In the middle of it all stood Elijah Carter, a proud black man dressed impeccably in his full Army service uniform. The gleaming medals pinned to his chest told stories of bravery, dedication, and years of service to his country. Elijah wasn't here to make a scene. He was just grabbing a few things before heading home, but not everyone saw it that way. From the corner of the lot, a police cruiser pulled in, the flashing lights off but the officer inside radiating tension. Officer Daniels, notorious in this town for his heavy-handed behavior, stepped out. His steely blue eyes locked onto Elijah almost immediately, narrowing as if Elijah's very presence offended him. "What do we have here?" Daniels muttered under his breath as he approached. He was already gripping his baton, not for use, but to send a message. "Hey, you," Daniels barked, loud enough to turn heads. "What are you doing out here dressed like that?" Elijah turned calm and collected. His posture, honed from years of discipline, didn't falter. "Excuse me," he replied evenly. Daniels smirked, already making a show for the growing audience. "I said, what are you doing dressed like that? Halloween was a couple of months ago. Stolen valor's a crime, you know." Elijah blinked, stunned but not surprised. Daniel's tone dripped with condescension, but it wasn't the first time Elijah had faced prejudice. It wouldn't be the last. The crowd began to murmur, sensing that something was off. Elijah's hand rested lightly on the strap of his duffel bag, his medals catching the sunlight. But instead of arguing, instead of reacting the way Daniels seemed to want, Elijah smiled faintly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady and firm. Daniels stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Oh, we'll see. How about you show me some ID before I call this in?" Elijah didn't flinch, but the crowd did. Tension was building, and the stage was set for something unforgettable. Elijah reached slowly into his pocket, aware of the eyes on him, some concerned, others curious, and a few that were simply entertained by the unfolding drama. His hand emerged with his military ID, which he handed to Officer Daniels without a word. Daniels snatched the card, flipping it over as if expecting to find a flaw or proof that it was fake. His thin lip smirk twisted further as he squinted at the information. HMPH Elijah Carter, Sergeant First Class, this real. Elijah didn't react to the insult. His composure was unshaken, his gaze steady as he answered. "It's as real as the Constitution you swore to uphold." The crowd murmured again, a few quiet chuckles rippling through those bold enough to appreciate the clever retort. But Daniels wasn't laughing. "Smart guy, huh?" Daniels muttered. He stepped closer, invading Elijah's space, his hand now resting on his belt near his holstered gun. "You don't look like a sergeant to me. You sure you didn't print this ID at home? Got a printer in that bag of yours?" Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't take the bait. "That bag," he said evenly, "has supplies for the veterans' shelter downtown. I volunteer there every week after my shifts at the base." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression laced with disbelief. "Veterans' shelter, huh? That's convenient." He turned his head slightly, addressing the crowd without looking at them. "What do you all think? Should we check the bag, just in case?" A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. A few shifted uncomfortably, while others stared at Daniels with open disapproval. "Search the bag," Daniels demanded, his voice rising as though daring anyone to object. "Unless, of course, you have something to hide, Sergeant Carter." The word sergeant dripped with mockery, but Elijah refused to let his temper flare. Instead, he gently placed the bag on the ground and stepped back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of patience. "Go ahead, officer, search the bag. You'll find nothing but blankets, canned goods, and respect for this country." Daniels crouched, unzipping the bag with exaggerated movements, as though he expected contraband to jump out. The crowd leaned in, curiosity at its peak. The contents of the bag, as Elijah had described, were mundane food, supplies, and carefully folded blankets emblazoned with the logo of the local veterans organization. Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Looks like you're full of surprises," Daniels sneered, rising to his feet. "Still doesn't explain why you're out here dressed like your General Patton." Elijah's calm demeanor didn't waver, but his sharp, calculating eyes were already working. He had no intention of letting this escalate further, but he wasn't about to let Daniels walk away unchallenged either. The crowd was growing restless, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Elijah clasped his hands behind his back, his stance a picture of discipline and strength. His steady gaze didn't leave Daniels, who now looked slightly less confident with the growing weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. Elijah could see it in the officer's body language, the exaggerated bravado of a man who knew he was losing control of the situation. "Elijah Carter," a voice called out from the crowd. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her face lighting up with recognition. "Sergeant Carter, my husband talks about you all the time from the shelter. You're the one who helped him find work after he came back from deployment, aren't you?" Elijah turned to her, offering a warm smile and a small nod. "Just doing what I can, ma'am." The woman's presence seemed to galvanize others. A young man raised his phone, recording the scene now with a pointed focus on Daniels. Another murmured, "He's a vet, and this cop's giving him trouble." Daniels heard it too, and his jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward his radio, as though calling for backup might salvage his authority. But before he could act, Elijah took a slow step forward, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, "do you know what these medals mean?" He gestured to his chest, where rows of gleaming decorations reflected the midday sun. Daniel's smirk returned, though it seemed thinner now. "I'm sure you're about to enlighten me." Elijah ignored the sarcasm, instead gesturing to one medal in particular. "This one is for saving the lives of 2 soldiers during an ambush overseas, and this one," he pointed to another, "is for leading my unit through a mission so dangerous it was classified for years. Every one of these represents not just my service, but my sacrifices." The crowd hung on his every word, their murmurs of support growing louder with each sentence. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his condescension faltering under the weight of Elijah's words and the stares of onlookers. "And yet," Elijah continued, his voice steady, "standing here in the uniform I earned through blood, sweat, and tears, I'm treated like a criminal, by someone who swore to protect and serve the same freedoms I fought for." The words landed like a thunderclap, and for a moment the lot was silent except for the distant hum of cars passing by. Daniel's face was flushed, and his smirk had completely disappeared. "You think I don't belong in this uniform," Elijah said, stepping closer to Daniels, his voice low enough that only the officer and the nearest onlookers could hear. "But you don't belong in yours." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Elijah straightened, turning back to the crowd. "And to anyone else wondering," he said loudly, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "I'm Sergeant First Class Elijah Carter, United States Army. I've given everything to this country, and I will not stand here and let anyone question my integrity." The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering, others shouting words of support. Daniels looked around, his confidence completely eroded, but Elijah wasn't finished yet. He had one more move to make, one that would leave no doubt about who truly held the moral high ground. The applause rippled through the crowd, echoing like a collective verdict. They stood with Elijah. Daniels, now visibly uncomfortable, adjusted his belt and glanced toward the cruiser, as though debating whether to retreat, but Elijah wasn't about to let him slip away without accountability. "Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his tone calm but commanding, "I'm curious what made you think I didn't belong in this uniform. Was it the color of my skin, or were you just looking for someone to harass today?" Daniels stiffened, his face a mix of indignation and embarrassment. "Watch your tone," he snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I was doing my job. It's standard procedure to question anyone who looks suspicious." Elijah raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "Suspicious? A man in uniform, carrying groceries for a veteran's shelter, is suspicious to you?" He paused, letting the question linger in the air. "Or is that just your excuse?" The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were openly calling Daniels out now. "Not a good look, officer," someone shouted. "Leave him alone." Another added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Daniel's face reddened further, his eyes darting between the crowd and Elijah. But Elijah wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that was calm yet piercing. "You see, Officer Daniels, I've spent my life protecting this country, including people like you. People who might never understand what true sacrifice looks like. But I've also learned something in my years of service. Real strength doesn't come from a badge, a gun, or authority. It comes from character." Daniels flinched slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. Elijah gestured toward the crowd, now watching the officer with open disdain. "And right now, all of these people can see the kind of character you've shown here today." Daniels opened his mouth, but Elijah cut him off. "Before you try to justify yourself again, let me ask you something." Elijah's eyes bore into Daniels with the quiet power of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to teach. How many lives have you saved in the line of duty? How many sacrifices have you made for the people you serve? Because I guarantee you, that number doesn't compare to the weight I've carried for this country." The officer's face twisted, but he had no response. His silence spoke volumes. Elijah straightened, addressing the crowd now. "This isn't just about me. It's about what we allow to happen in our communities. People like Officer Daniels are supposed to protect us, not target us because of how we look. If we don't call it out, it will keep happening, not just to me, but to every person who looks like me." The crowd roared with approval, many nodding in agreement. Phones were raised higher, capturing every word, ensuring that this moment wouldn't be forgotten. Daniels looked around, his face pale now despite his flushed complexion. But Elijah wasn't done yet. There was still one final, decisive move to make, a move that would cement the lesson Daniels was about to learn and ensure the officer's behavior wouldn't be overlooked by those with the power to hold him accountable. Daniels shifted uneasily, the weight of the crowd's judgment bearing down on him. His hand hovered near his radio again, but this time it wasn't confidence guiding him, it was desperation. Elijah noticed and spoke before the officer could act. Thinking about calling for backup, Elijah asked, his tone measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Go ahead, call them. Let them see how you've handled this. Let them see how you've escalated a situation with a veteran who's done nothing wrong." Daniels froze, his hand dropping to his side. His authority was crumbling under the collective weight of the crowd and Elijah's unwavering composure. But Elijah wasn't stopping there. Turning toward the people gathered around, Elijah raised his voice just enough to be heard clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to remember something. This isn't just about one officer making a mistake. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. But the good news," he paused, letting the moment hang, "we don't have to stand for it." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder with every passing second. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah's sharp gaze silenced him before he could speak. "You see, Officer Daniels," Elijah said, gesturing to the phone still recording, "you thought you could intimidate me. You thought I'd be another nameless, faceless person you could push around without consequence. But here's the thing, you picked the wrong man today." Daniel's face reddened further, his bravado now fully replaced by unease. Elijah reached into his pocket again, pulling out a card. With deliberate precision, he handed it to Daniels, who stared at it suspiciously before reading the bold print at the top. "Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. I work closely with this department," Elijah explained, his voice calm but resolute. "If you think for 1 second that I won't file a formal complaint about this incident, you're sorely mistaken." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniels looked as though the ground beneath him might swallow him whole. Elijah wasn't just a veteran, he was a man with connections, knowledge, and the power to hold someone like Daniels accountable. But Elijah wasn't done yet. Turning toward the crowd once more, he said, "It's not enough to record moments like these. It's not enough to share them online. Real change happens when we hold people accountable, not just for their actions, but for the culture they create." Daniel's radio crackled to life, a dispatcher calling for an update. The officer fumbled with it, muttering a terse response, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Elijah let the silence hang for a moment before stepping forward again, his tone softening but losing none of its power. "Officer, this is your chance. Right now, you can choose to reflect, to learn, to be better. Or you can keep walking this path of fear and prejudice." Daniel's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Elijah. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. The tension in the air was electric. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something else that was harder to read. His hands fidgeted at his sides, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Elijah spoke first. "Before you respond, let me remind you of one thing," Elijah said, his tone as sharp as ever. "What you say next will define you, not just to me, but to every person watching here, and everyone who will see this video later. Choose your words carefully, Officer Daniels." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective gaze locked on Daniels. Phones were raised higher, capturing the moment in detail. Daniels looked around, clearly aware of the growing threat to his reputation. But instead of taking the opportunity to apologize or to escalate, he chose the path of defiance. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Daniels muttered, his voice low but audible. "I was just doing my job." Elijah's expression didn't waver. "Your job," he repeated slowly, as if weighing the words. Is it your job to target law-abiding citizens? Is it your job to question the integrity of someone who's done more for this country than you could imagine? Or is it your job to protect and serve all people, regardless of their skin color? Daniels flinched at the last question, but he still didn't answer. The silence was deafening, and the crowd was no longer murmuring. It was openly voicing its disapproval. "You were wrong," a man called out from the crowd. "Apologize," shouted another. Daniels' jaw clenched, and he turned toward the crowd. "You don't understand what it's like out here," he snapped, his voice defensive. "I can't take chances, You can't take chances," Elijah interrupted, his voice slicing through Daniels' excuse like a knife. "Let me tell you about taking chances, Officer Daniels. I took a chance every time I stepped onto the battlefield. I took a chance when I fought to protect the freedoms you're so quick to abuse. And I took a chance today, standing here, hoping that you'd prove yourself to be better than your assumptions." The crowd roared its approval, and Daniels looked like he wanted to disappear. Elijah, however, didn't let up. "You talk about not taking chances," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "But the truth is, you weren't afraid of a threat today. You were afraid of me, of what I represent, and that fear isn't my responsibility, it's yours to confront and overcome." Daniels shifted on his feet, his bravado cracking further under the weight of Elijah's words. For the first time he looked truly unsure of himself, glancing at the crowd as if searching for support. But there was none to be found. Elijah stepped back, his posture still firm and commanding. "The question now, Officer Daniels, is whether you are brave enough to admit your mistake and learn from it. Or will you let your pride keep you on a path that will only lead to more harm, for others and for yourself?" Daniels' mouth opened, but no words came out. The crowd waited with bated breath, the tension almost unbearable. Would he finally take accountability, or would he let the moment slip away, further tarnishing his reputation? The answer was only seconds away, and everyone could feel that something pivotal was about to happen. Daniels stood frozen, his face a mask of indecision. His eyes darted between Elijah, the crowd, and the phone still trained on him. The weight of accountability was closing in, and for a moment it looked like he might crack under the pressure. But then his pride flared one last time. "I don't owe you anything," Daniels muttered, though his voice was barely audible. "I'm just doing my job." The crowd groaned collectively, disappointment and frustration rippling through the onlookers. Someone called out, "That's not good enough," while another added, "You're the problem, Daniels." Elijah remained calm, though the steel in his gaze grew sharper. "No accountability, then?" he asked, his voice low but resonant. "That's your choice, officer. But know this, every single person here is a witness. Every camera here is documenting what happened, and when this goes public, your words, your actions, and your lack of integrity will speak louder than any excuse you can come up with." Daniels' face turned redder, but he said nothing. His silence only solidified the crowd's perception of him, and the murmurs of disapproval grew louder. Elijah took another step forward, commanding the moment with quiet power. "You could have chosen to be an example today," he said, his voice steady and measured. "You could have chosen to show what it means to serve with honor and humility. Instead, you chose fear. You chose pride, and now you'll have to live with that choice." Daniels' radio crackled again, cutting through the tension. The dispatcher's voice called for his attention, but he didn't respond. His hands balled into fists at his sides, the frustration boiling over but unable to find release. Elijah turned back to the crowd, addressing them with the same calm authority he'd displayed throughout the encounter. "This isn't just about one officer," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to persist. We have to demand better, not just from the people in power, but from the systems that protect them when they're wrong." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a collective affirmation of Elijah's message. Daniels looked around, his confidence now fully shattered. The weight of the moment was undeniable, and he seemed to realize that his time was running out. Then Elijah turned back to Daniels, his tone softening slightly but still firm. "This is your chance, Officer Daniels. You can walk away and let this moment define you as a coward. Or you can take responsibility, right here, right now, and prove that you're capable of growth." Daniels stared at him, his expression unreadable. For the first time, his defenses seemed to falter, and a flicker of something almost like regret crossed his face. The crowd fell silent again, waiting for his response. Would Daniels finally take accountability? Or was he too far gone, too entrenched in his pride to change? The answer hung in the air, every second feeling heavier than the last. The silence stretched unbearably long, the crowd holding its collective breath as Daniels struggled with his decision. His eyes darted back and forth between Elijah, the crowd, and the phones that continued to record. His pride was visibly battling with his conscience. Finally, Daniels exhaled sharply, dropping his gaze to the ground. "You're right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The crowd stilled, unsure if they had heard him correctly. "What was that?" Elijah asked, his tone firm but not unkind. He stepped closer, forcing Daniels to look him in the eye. "Say it again, louder, so everyone here knows you're taking responsibility." Daniels swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he forced the words out. "You're right, I was wrong." His voice was louder now, though strained. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I made an assumption, and it was wrong." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but Elijah didn't let him off the hook so easily. "And what are you going to do about it?" he pressed. Daniels hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I'll report this incident myself," he said reluctantly. "I'll let my supervisor know what happened, and he faltered but caught himself. "I'll do better." The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering while others nodded in satisfaction. Daniels looked deeply uncomfortable, but there was a small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture, relief, perhaps, at having finally admitted his fault. Elijah stepped back, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he extended his hand toward Daniels. The officer looked at it, clearly surprised. "This isn't about humiliating you," Elijah said. "It's about accountability. Growth starts with admitting you were wrong. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect and be better, for yourself, and for the people you serve." Daniels hesitated, then slowly extended his own hand, shaking Elijah's firmly. It wasn't a moment of forgiveness, it was a moment of resolution. The crowd burst into cheers again, capturing the moment as a symbol of strength and reconciliation. As Daniels stepped back toward his cruiser, clearly humbled, Elijah turned to the crowd. "We've got a long way to go," he said, his voice loud and steady. "But every time we stand up, every time we demand better, we get one step closer to a world where no one has to face this kind of treatment again." The crowd applauded louder than ever, their voices rising in unity. Elijah picked up his duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder as he prepared to leave. As he walked away, a young man from the crowd called out, "Sergeant Carter, you're a hero." Elijah paused, turning back with a small smile. "The real heroes," he said, "are the ones who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." With that, he walked away, leaving behind a parking lot full of people inspired by his strength, resilience, and unwavering commitment to justice. The story of Sergeant Elijah Carter would spread far and wide, a powerful reminder of how integrity and courage could turn even the ugliest moments into opportunities for change.